In a small village in central Nigeria, that night should have been ordinary. Oil lamps still burned inside the church. Soft singing could be heard. People knelt. Hands were raised. Prayers flowed. Then, everything changed in a matter of seconds. Gunfire shattered the silence. Screams, running, smoke, fire. In less than an hour, homes were consumed by flames. Bodies lay scattered on the ground. The church that had just been filled with prayer now remained only as ruins and black smoke rising into the night sky. There was no warning, no help. No one came. And this was not an isolated incident. Across Nigeria, especially in the Middle Belt and the north, the same pattern keeps repeating. Village after village is emptied. Church after church is burned. Family after family is erased from the map. More than 52,000 people have been killed. Thousands more are missing, and the world has said almost nothing. Is this merely a complicated local conflict, or a silent genocide unfolding before our eyes? Let us look more closely. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa and one of the most densely populated in the world. With a population now estimated to exceed 240 million, the nation is not only a center of economic and political power in West Africa, but also home to two of the continent's largest religious communities. Roughly half the population follows Islam, while nearly half is Christian. In many areas, particularly in the Middle Belt that forms the country's geographical heart, the dividing line between the two is often blurred. Muslims and Christians live side by side in the same markets, the same schools, even within the same families. For centuries, this coexistence was accepted as a normal part of everyday life. The long history of both religions in Nigeria helps explain why relations remained relatively stable for so long. Islam established itself in the north from the 11th century, arriving through Saharan trade routes and gradually shaping the cultural and political identity of the region. Christianity, meanwhile, grew more strongly in the south during the 19th century, with the arrival of European missionaries and the development of local communities that embraced the new faith. Although tensions had occurred, both in the colonial period and after independence, interfaith relations in many areas were still marked by reasonably harmonious social interaction. Trade, interfaith marriage, and interdependent community life created a kind of balance that lasted for decades. In the past 2 decades, however, that balance has begun to fracture deeply. Since the late 1990s, and more sharply after 2009, the pattern of violence in Nigeria has changed dramatically. In the northeast, armed groups emerged that openly targeted schools, churches, and Christian communities as part of their ideology. In the Middle Belt, nighttime attacks on Christian farming villages became increasingly regular, planned, and deadly. What was once often described as local conflict or resource clashes now shows a more systematic pattern. Nigeria, once an example of religious coexistence in Africa, has slowly become one of the most dangerous places in the world. For those who follow the Christian faith, the question is no longer whether the violence is happening, but why it has been allowed to continue for so long under the eyes of the world. The threat now tearing at Christian communities in Nigeria did not appear suddenly. Its roots can be traced to the early 2000s in the country's northeast. In 2002, a local cleric named Muhammad Yusuf founded a religious movement in Maiduguri, the capital of Borno State. The movement rejected Western education, the secular system of government, and any influence considered contrary to their strict interpretation of Islam. At first, the group later known as Boko Haram was more isolationist and focused on preaching. Beneath the surface, however, the anti-Western ideology they spread gradually planted seeds of hostility towards everything seen as a symbol of foreign influence, including schools, government institutions, and Christian communities regarded as an extension of the Western world. The decisive turning point came in July 2009. After a series of clashes with security forces, Muhammad Yusuf was arrested and later killed in police custody. His extrajudicial death triggered a wave of anger among his followers. Under the new leadership of Abubakar Shekau, Boko Haram changed completely. From a relatively closed religious movement, the group transformed into a systematic machine of violence. Between 2009 and the mid-2010s, they regularly attacked churches during services, massacred congregations, executed pastors, and kidnapped hundreds of Christian schoolgirls. In their ideology, Christian communities were not ordinary civilian targets, but symbols of Western influence that had to be destroyed. Every attack was designed to terrify empty territories and weaken the Christian presence in the areas they targeted. Yet the threat did not stop with Boko Haram. In 2016, a significant internal split occurred. Global ISIS leadership grew dissatisfied with Shekau's style, which was considered too brutal even towards fellow Muslims. They then backed a new faction led by Abu Musab al-Barnawi, the son of Boko Haram's founder. From this split emerged the Islamic State West Africa Province, or ISWAP, a more organized, more strategic group that continued to maintain an agenda of targeting Christian populations. At the same time, in the Middle Belt, another threat grew in parallel. Certain armed factions from the Fulani herder community began carrying out highly patterned night attacks on Christian farming villages. They arrived without official uniforms, burned homes and churches, killed residents trying to flee, and disappeared before dawn. These three forces, Boko Haram, ISWAP, and extreme Fulani militias, though different in structure and history, ultimately produced the same result: the systematic emptying of Christian areas across various parts of Nigeria. From a distance, the violence in Nigeria often appears as a series of random and disconnected events. The closer we examine it, however, the clearer a pattern becomes that repeats with terrifying precision. Attacks usually come in the middle of the night while the village is asleep. Armed groups surround the settlement, burn homes and churches, then shoot residents trying to escape the flames. Crops in the fields are destroyed, livestock are killed or driven away, and within hours a once living village is reduced to ruins and smoke. Before dawn, the attackers have already vanished into the darkness, leaving behind corpses, fear, and total destruction. This pattern is not accidental. It repeats across the Middle Belt and northern Nigeria in almost identical ways, as if following a shared script. What makes the pattern even more horrifying is the choice of targets. The villages attacked are almost always remote Christian communities, with little security protection and far from centers of government. They are soft targets, unarmed, isolated, and often ignored by the state. For groups such as Boko Haram and ISWAP, attacking Christian communities is not only about taking lives, but also about erasing symbols. Burned churches, destroyed schools, and executed pastors send a clear message that the Christian presence in those areas is no longer tolerated. Meanwhile, in the Middle Belt, armed militia attacks on Christian farmers are often framed as land or herding conflicts. Yet when places of worship are also burned and residents are selected according to their religious identity, the pattern becomes difficult to explain as mere resource clashes. The impact of this pattern of violence goes far beyond the death toll. Village after village is emptied. Survivors are forced to flee to cities or displacement camps, leaving behind land their families have farmed for generations. In the long term, the identity of entire regions changes. Areas once inhabited by Christian communities gradually lose their original populations. Thousands of churches have been destroyed or severely damaged. Tens of thousands of people have been killed, and thousands more, especially children and women, have been kidnapped, forcibly disappeared, or used as bargaining tools. What remains is not only physical wounds, but also a fear that is passed from one generation to the next. And as long as this pattern continues without firm action, the emptying of Christian areas in Nigeria appears to be a process that advances without end. Amid a pattern of violence that is increasingly clear and repetitive, the official response of the Nigerian government often feels cautious, even evasive. Rather than acknowledging systematic targeting of Christian communities, State authorities prefer more neutral and less confrontational terms. Farmer-herder conflict, banditry, or local tensions. Behind this choice of language lies complicated political calculation. Nigeria is a country with a nearly balanced religious composition, openly admitting that one group is being targeted because of its religious identity risks triggering mass anger, sectarian retaliation, and even threats to national unity. In addition, many political coalitions depend on support from the Muslim-majority North. In such a context, silence and simplified narratives become the safer political choice, even though the cost is paid by remote villages that continue to be consumed by violence. On the ground, structural weaknesses make the situation worse. Security forces are often short of equipment, logistics, and motivation to protect rural areas far from centers of power. Corruption at various levels creates empty spaces that armed groups easily fill. Meanwhile, the international community also appears reluctant to look at the problem clearly. Western media coverage of violence in Nigeria is often generalized as resource conflict, climate change, or simply regional instability. The religious aspect, so real to the victims, is rarely stated firmly. International institutions are more comfortable speaking of a humanitarian crisis or communal tensions than acknowledging a pattern of faith-based targeting. This reluctance is not without reason. Calling it genocide or religious persecution openly would demand a stronger political response, including diplomatic pressure and possible sanctions. For many countries and organizations, holding back is easier than bearing the consequences of such recognition. As a result, thousands of victims in Nigeria seem to drown in a double silence, ignored by their own government and softened in the telling by the outside world. All that remains is a question that grows more unsettling. How long will this silence continue to be maintained, while village after village disappears from the map? More than 52,000 lives have been lost. Thousands of churches lie in ruins. Villages that once lived now remain only as rubble and memory. Behind those numbers lies a pattern that is hard to ignore. Repeated violence, consistent targeting, and an almost systematic silence, both from within the country and from the outside world. Nigeria's history is being rewritten through the smoke of burned villages and the mass displacement of communities that have lost their land. Yet history does not only record what happened, it also records who chose to look and who chose to turn away. The question is no longer whether this violence is real. The question is whether we will one day remember it as a tragedy that was allowed to unfold in silence, or as a warning that was finally heard before too much was lost forever.